just as a few last people get their seats. My name is Deacon Jim Pancho. I am a pastoral counselor here on the campus ministry team and also the coordinator of the Veritas lecture series. It is my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening. We begin by acknowledging that King's College at Western University is located in close proximity to three vibrant local First Nations who have long-standing relationships with the land and the place we now recognize as London, Ontario. Chippewa of the Thames First Nation, which is part of the Anishinaabe Nation, Oneida Nation of the Thames, part of the Haudenosaunee Six Nations, and the Munsee Delaware Nation, part of the Lenni Lenape Nation. Historically, the Attawandaron peoples also once settled this region alongside the Algonquin and Haudenosaunee peoples and used this land as their traditional beaver hunting grounds. Today, a diverse and growing Indigenous population live in London and the surrounding areas. It is my great pleasure this evening to welcome Joseph Cardinal Tobin, who comes to us who is the Archbishop and comes to us from the Archdiocese of Newark. Archbishop Tobin was created a cardinal in 2016. He graduated from Mount St. Alphonsus Seminary with an MA in Religious Education and a Master of Arts in Divinity in 1979. Among other responsibilities, Cardinal Tobin serves as the Archbishop Secretary for the Congregation for Institutes of Consecrated Life and Societies of Apostolic Life. He also sits on the USCCB Administrative Committee, Catholic Education Committee, National Collections Committee, the Subcommittee on the Church in Africa, and the Committee on Clergy, Consecrated Life, and Vocations. He is a member of the Joint International Commission for International Dialogue between the Catholic and Orthodox and co-chair of the North American Catholic Orthodox Theological Consultation. Continuing on our theme of building bridges of inclusion, Cardinal Tobin will speak tonight on who is my brother and sister and mother. I have to say that after the official bio, my favorite story of Cardinal Tobin is what I found in an article when he was weightlifting in a local gym, and someone asked, well, what do you do for a living? And he said, well, I used to be a priest. And now is a cardinal and an archbishop. So it's a wonderful pleasure to welcome him. Please join me in welcoming Cardinal Tobin.
Thank you, Deacon Jim, and thank you for that warm round of applause. I've come to know that people who applaud before they hear a speaker speak are very kind. 25 years ago, when I worked honestly in the church, I was a pastor on the north side of Chicago. And I still stay in touch with those people. They send me messages and emails and give me the gossip and let me know who's gone home to God and who got married and new babies. And I had an email last spring from a young father in the parish. I think he was an altar boy when I was the pastor. And Tom is his name. Tom was walking home from Mass with his 7-year-old son, Sam. Now, Sam was grade 2, and that's a very important year because he's going to make his first communion. And he's watching everything that's going on in church. Now, his dad, Tom, that particular Sunday was having a hard time figuring out the homily. Imagine that. And he turned to Sam finally on the sidewalk and he said, Sam, who do you think Father was talking to tonight, this morning? Was he talking to the grown-ups or was he talking to the little kids? So Sam thought this over. And he looked up with a bright look on his face and he said, I think he was talking to himself. And that's an occupational hazard for priests and bishops, not the Bishop of London, I would hasten to say, or the auxiliary bishop. But for some of us, we get up here with all sorts of good intentions. And we convey a message and we end up talking to ourselves. Well, I hope I'm not going to do that tonight, but you will be the judge. I'll give you an idea of what I hope to do. In considering that question that Jesus asked, who is my mother and my brother and my sisters? I'd like to begin with an experience that helped me understand that the church is not insulated from some of the really detrimental influences in the ambient culture, in its wider culture. Then I'd like to talk a bit about the gospel imperative, to be welcoming, to be inclusive, if you will. And then ask the question whether Pope Francis is helping this or not. A blessing in my life was living 21 years outside of North America. I served 18 years in the government of the religious order I belonged to, the Redemptorist Missionaries, left Rome in 2009, was trying to read a book at Oxford and got called back. I served 2 more years in the dicastery. It was a blessing for a number of reasons. I understand better what the word Catholic means in seeing, glimpsing the life of the billion-plus Catholics that serve God on the face of the earth today. The order I belong to works in 78 countries. Over 18 years, I made it to 71 of them. And so a seminal experience happened to me early on in that sojourn. I think it was around 1992, 93. I was sent by my boss with another assistant superior general to the Latin American country of Chile. We arrived there coincidentally just after the brothers had gotten together to elect the leadership for our order in that country that would supervise the 12 or 15 communities that were serving at that time. The fellow was elected on the 35th ballot of the provincial chapter. He hadn't received any votes on the first 34. Now, you don't have to be a student at King's College to figure out this is one divided group. So a couple days later, walking in the garden with the sacrificial lamb, I asked him what happened. I said, Raul, what was going on in the chapter that it took this long to reach an agreement? He said to me, if you want to understand us, you have to understand we lived under a military dictatorship from 1973 till about 1988 or 89, so 3 or 4 years before I arrived. He went on to say, we hated it. We denounced the dictators from the pulpit. We demonstrated with the people. Some of us went to jail. We put our lives on the line to make the military fall. But he said, without us being aware of it, their way of thinking penetrated us. So we treat each other now as military juntas do. And when one junta takes power, they exile the enemies of the state to the farthest reaches of the province. It's like a little light bulb went on from that conversation. And I began to see it in other parts of the world. In Eastern Europe, people detested the communists, but they learned a lot from them. And not all of it was good. If you're at all familiar with religious life in South Asia, you know that a sort of fundamental equality that is so prized among religious, in fact, is often seriously undermined by a caste system that's been in power for 4,000 years. So one of the great surprises, and I had a lot of surprises when I came back to North America after 21 years. I mean, I never have seen Seinfeld. And in the United States, that's a serious learning defect. Because people will say, well, you know Cardinal and Seinfeld? I say, no, I don't. I never saw Seinfeld. Worst, being in New Jersey, is I never saw The Sopranos. The Sopranos came and went, and I was someplace else. But I don't remember the degree of polarization in the United States that I experience now. Incredible polarization. And it increasingly, at least in that country, characterizes the life of the Catholic Church. Furthermore, there's evidence that information technology, far from providing a catalyst towards a richer conversation among different groups in the public square, or the virtual public square, instead exacerbates the ideological divide and aggravates alienation by allowing us to quickly discover which blogs and which websites favor our point of view while isolating us from contrary opinions. Where does this come from? Where do you think we can discover the roots of a contemporary intensification of intolerance? Of course, intolerance and division aren't the invention of the 21st century. 20 centuries ago, a Jewish teacher from Nazareth in Galilee excited passionate opposition that eventually led to his execution. His crime? Well, among the allegations, associating with outcasts, preaching and even working miracles in a religious and social no man's land, a place where pious Jews would not be comfortable. We know from the Gospels that Jesus himself probably had to be convinced that his mission was to people in those places, as well as to the house of Israel. And 2,000 years later, we can identify a similar place today. I believe the place is being created, even expanded, through a process of boundary maintenance in both society and the church. Boundary maintenance. It was an idea of Emile Durkheim, the French social theorist. He proposed that law and crime function to mark the boundaries of acceptable and unacceptable behavior in any large-scale society. That is, they represent broad social guidelines for people's behavior. As historians know, boundaries, be they cultural, ethical, or geographic, can be revised. This is not necessarily a bad thing. I think that the Council of Jerusalem, that we read about in the 15th chapter of the Acts of the Apostles, the Nicene Creed, and the doctrine of the Second Vatican Council all represent some sort of boundary maintenance, insofar as their efforts to clarify the identity of a group by elucidating their essential norms. I also believe that we can agree, perhaps, that both society and church are engaged in a process of boundary maintenance today. In part, this movement has been provoked by postmodernity, understood as a set of cultural circumstances that signifies the obliteration of boundaries and the confusion of categories. Societies experience globalization and the mass migration of peoples. The church wrestles with relativism and an often vapid catechesis. As a result, new lines are drawn in the sands of the Sonoran Desert on the southern border of the United States, while clear doctrinal statements seem to shortcut dialogue. Fresh or reinforced boundaries create new spaces in which the marginalized are consigned. In apparent contradiction of the norms and cultural practices of the Judaism of his time, Jesus healed the sick and multiplied loaves and fishes in pagan territory, a place that could not be seen from the heights of Jerusalem. But this space also existed within the traditional territory of Judah. Otherwise, how can we understand the consistent accusation that was leveled against Jesus, a charge that probably contributed to his arrest and execution, that he shared table fellowship with those beyond the pale? The question is asked just early in the second chapter of Mark's Gospel. Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? It is easy for the church to overlook this action of Jesus. I was a member of the 2005 Synod of Bishops that was concerned with the Eucharist. The synod lasted nearly a month, and you might imagine the number of speeches that were shared and the vast range of scripture that was reviewed. To my shame, it was only afterwards that I realized that in no debate was reference made to any verse that spoke of Jesus sharing table fellowship with sinners. Before pointing my finger at any other member of the synod, I accuse myself of having a scandalously bad memory. Now, lest I be misunderstood, let me repeat clearly that boundaries are not intrinsically evil. A lack of personal boundaries or an unwillingness to respect the distinctiveness of another person are often indications of psychological pathology or even criminal behavior. God intends that the church have identifiable characteristics, such as the 4 that we pronounce every Sunday in the Creed: 1, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. However, lest we be too quick to exclude others, Jesus insists that the world will recognize us as his disciples, first and foremost, by our love for each other. And he prays that we will all be one, so that the world might believe that you have sent me. How to understand the gospel imperative for inclusion of the marginalized. The title of this talk is a question originally formulated by Jesus: who is my brother and sister and mother? I'd like to meditate on that with a series of other questions. Questions that he put to a lawyer in Luke's gospel. It's interesting and I think instructive to see how the questions change. You might remember, the lawyer comes to Jesus and asks, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" That question will change. It then becomes, who is my neighbor? And then the final question is asked by Jesus: which of these 3, in your opinion, was neighbor to the robber's victim? Jesus' reply not only challenges the premise, but brings a shocking surprise. Each of us is to be a neighbor and realize that the neighbors can come from surprising places. Let's think a little bit more about that dialogue and the story that Jesus tells. Because I think with the passage of time and the familiarity of the story of the Good Samaritan, the real impact it originally had is lost today. After centuries of good biblical public relations, our understanding of a Samaritan as a positive figure is almost a cultural given. The media often refers to someone who stops in a snowstorm as a Samaritan. But in the original setting, to a Jewish scribe, a Samaritan would have been exactly the opposite: a notorious bad guy and a traitor. The hero of the story is the bad guy. Culturally, he's the last person we would expect to be hailed as an exemplary neighbor. In fact, the parable turns the whole question around. The lawyer asks, who is his neighbor? And I think he's asking in the hope that there are some people who are not his neighbors. Jesus replies, just be a neighbor where you are needed and realize that neighbors can come from surprising places. In Jesus' story, a man is overcome by a band of robbers and left on the road to die. You remember this. As he lies there, his life passes before him, and not just his life. Then a priest comes down the road. The expectation culturally would be relief. Surely help is on the way. Luke's statement that the priest appeared by chance in the original Greek suggests a note of hope that fortune has finally smiled on the wounded man. But the priest does not stop. Rather, he crosses to the other side and keeps going. The detail about crossing the road, I think, is no accident. It's a brilliant use of literary space. The priest gets as far away from the wounded man as he can. He passes by. A Levite, another potential source of aid, arrives on the scene. As one who served in the temple, he surely will have compassion. He'll stop and render aid. But when he sees the man, he also crosses to the other side of the road and keeps on moving. So two men of similar Jewish background have failed to render aid. They have failed to be neighbors. Interpreters speculate, why did they refuse to help? Do they fear being mugged themselves? Do they fear being rendered unclean? The text gives no reason. As is often the case, the bother and discomfort of helping have kept the man dying on the road. Getting involved is costly, and for many, the investment is too high. But to refuse is a moral failure. By now, another traveler comes on the scene. In Greek, the text highlights the man's arrival by placing his ethnic identity, a Samaritan, at the front of the description. The scribe hearing Jesus tell the story must be thinking, there'll be no help from that half-breed. But as often happens in Jesus' parables, a twist on the cultural expectations yields the story's main point. The despised schismatic will be the model of neighborliness. Can you imagine that enemies can love God and be examples? Jesus focuses his language now. In many words he uses to describe the activity of the two Jewish leaders. He details all of the Samaritan does to save the man. 6 actions in all. He comes up to the man, binds his wounds, anoints him with oil to comfort him, loads him on his mule, takes him to an inn, and cares for him, even paying for his whole stay. In fact, given the amount the Samaritan leaves with the innkeeper, the injured man probably has about 3.5 weeks to recover if he needs it, since the going-in rate was 1/12 of a denarius, and 2 denarii were 2 days' wages. Jesus' question to close the story requires no brilliant reply. Which of these 3 do you think was neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The lawyer knows, but he cannot bring himself to mention the man's race. The lawyer is choosy about his neighbors. He does not understand the call of God. Nevertheless, he stammers, the one who had mercy on him. The reply is correct. So Jesus says, go and do likewise. Jesus' point is simply this: not who is our neighbor, it's rather be a neighbor. Do not rule out certain people as neighbors. And his parable makes the point emphatically by providing a model from a group the lawyer had probably excluded as possible neighbors. So the third question, is Pope Francis opening new paths for Catholic Christians in others? Could I tell you my second favorite Francis story? A couple of years ago, before the general audience on a Wednesday, he was riding around in the Pope Mobile on St. Peter's Square. And a group of people were holding up a gourd with a metal straw in it. And he recognized, being from Argentina, what it probably was, a type of tea the Argentinians really like, yerba mate. And so he took it from the group and took a couple slurps and gave it back. And afterwards, the security went crazy. And they said to him after the audience, "You can't do that. It's a dangerous world. There are threats everywhere. ISIS, Islamic State. You can't eat pizza when they hand it to you," which he does sometimes. "And you should have passed on that mate." And Pope Francis, with great patience, said, "Those people were Argentinians. They weren't cardinals." I'll tell you my favorite Francis story in a moment. But is he opening a new path for Catholic Christians and for others? I think he is. It probably doesn't surprise you. But let's go back one pope. I think that the immediate predecessor to Pope Francis, Pope Benedict XVI, was already aware of the space that was being created by modern examples of boundary maintenance in the church and beyond, and thought a great deal about how to reach those who felt themselves excluded. This led him to consistently affirm that the gospel must be presented first and foremost, not as a moral code to be obeyed or a lofty idea, but rather as an invitation to transformation, to an intimate friendship with the living God. Francis is building on that intuition of Benedict and opening new paths for Catholic Christians and others. And I'll offer you two reasons to support that claim. First, Francis is developing a robust pastoral theology, inviting the church to a new way of acting. And I think there are three fundamental foundations for this pastoral theology. First, the assertion that not only the activity, but the very nature of the church involves at its heart pastoral action to heal the hearts of men and women who are suffering. One of his famous statements of this assertion. He said, "I can clearly see that the thing the church needs most today is the ability to heal wounds and to warm the hearts of the faithful. It needs nearness, proximity. I see the church as a field hospital after battle. It is useless to ask a seriously injured person if he has high cholesterol and about the level of her blood sugar. You have to heal her wounds. Then we can talk about everything else. Heal the wounds, and you have to start from the ground up." What an interesting image, a field hospital. You recall that the Second Vatican Council proposed several, I think about 3 principal and beautiful images for the church. The saving sacrament of Christ's unity and mission. The pilgrim people journeying together to their heavenly home. A mystical body with its complementarity among its members and its headship in Christ. Each of these images underscores a key element of the sacred identity and the ministry of the community which Jesus founded to sanctify the world. So Francis proposes another image, that of a field hospital. I believe the image of the church as a field hospital is powerful testimony to the nature and role of the community of faith in the world today. It speaks to the centrality of God's action in the life of the church, an action which begins, as Jesus did, by healing women and men in their brokenness, thus opening them up to receive the grace of God in their hearts as that grace is made manifest. The image of the church as a field hospital points to the reality that the church is never remote from human experience, never self-referential if it is to be faithful to its mission and arguably to maintain its health. Because Francis, hours before the conclave began, said to his brother cardinals, "A church that lives with its eyes turned in on itself becomes sick." Rather, the church must always be enmeshed in the real lives and suffering and challenges and joys of the people of God and of all humanity. The image of a pilgrim people of God emphasized the common journey in grace of those in the church. The image of the church as sacrament emphasized the nature of the church as a reflection of the transforming power of God in the world. The image of the mystical body emphasized the complementarity of all within the life of the church and the subjection of all to the person of Jesus Christ. The image of the field hospital emphasizes the explicitly pastoral identity of the church, reaching into the lives of men and women precisely in their greatest suffering to reveal the multiple dimensions of the saving love that comes from God. The second foundation for the pastoral theology that Pope Francis is pointing out lies in the recognition that the church should mirror the pastoral action of the Lord himself. And let me introduce this reflection with my favorite Francis story. I heard it from two different sources, and they were well placed, and I have no reason to doubt it. But as they say in Italian, if it's not true, it's still worth telling. You be the judge. Weeks after his election, he called the Secretary of State for the Holy See, at the time Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone, with a request. He said, I want to go to Lampedusa. You might know that Lampedusa is an island in the southern Mediterranean, part of the Italian Republic, but actually closer to Africa than it is to the Italian mainland. It's a destination for many of the refugees who are escaping war and misery in Africa and in the Middle East. And hundreds, perhaps thousands of them, certainly thousands of them, have died in the waters around the island. Well, the Secretary of State knew that this would be seen as his first trip abroad, even though he's not technically leaving Italy, but abroad. And so he tried to talk him out of it. He said, this is just your first trip. You may not be sending the message you want to send, and you just got elected. So perhaps it's time to get the Roman house in order first. A week later, the Cardinal got a phone call from Francis, and he said, I want to go to Lampedusa. By this time, the Cardinal had concluded that his mind was made up. So he decided to do what we in the Roman Curia can do very well, and that's delay. One of my colleagues used to say, Tobin, we work in the eternal city, and all of us set our watches accordingly. And so the Cardinal said to Pope Francis, well, you just can't expect these trips to happen overnight. I mean, there's details, there's logistics, media, security, perhaps 6 months, maybe a year. So a few more weeks passed, and the Cardinal got a phone call, this time not from the Holy Father, but from one of the vice presidents of Alitalia, which is the Italian national air carrier. And the vice president said, Your Eminence, we thought you people would want to know that a passenger by the name of Jorge Bergoglio has reserved a seat on the flight from Rome to Lampedusa. The Vatican moved, and by the end of June, he made his visit. He's imitating the image of the pastoral action of the Lord, and let me explain why. It's the pattern of Jesus Christ who walked the earth, which we are to incorporate into every element of the life of the church. The enduring truth is that the foundation for a series of imperatives that Francis has presented to the church over the last 5 years is just this: to minister the way Jesus ministered. One of the most important of these imperatives is his call to accompaniment. In the Joy of the Gospel, Pope Francis beautifully expresses both the depth of commitment and the openness that must flood the pastoral life and action of the church. And I quote, We will have to initiate everyone, priests, religious, and laity, into this act of accompaniment, which teaches us to remove our sandals before the sacred ground of the other. Before the sacred ground of the other. When Jesus encountered Zacchaeus in the tree, he was encountering a man despised for his theft and the victimization of others. But Christ's piercingly compassionate embrace, conveyed in the call to eat at the house of this outcast, was sufficient to transform a hardened sinner. In patterning the church's life after the ministry of Jesus Christ, the starting point is the drive to see and treat every person as God sees them, as an incredibly precious soul, individual in its nature and identity, yet equally treasured by the Lord. The second pastoral imperative of the pastoral theology of Pope Francis urges us to model our pastoral action on the three steps that formed Jesus' encounter with those who were suffering or estranged. What did Jesus do? First, the Lord embraces the person, and then he heals them. Then he calls them to reform. Each of these elements of the saving encounter with the Lord is essential, but their order is also essential. Christ first reveals the overwhelmingly merciful and limitless love of God. Then he moves to heal the particular form of suffering that the person is experiencing. Only then does he call the person specifically to a change in their life. This pattern must become ever more deeply the model for the church's proclamation of the faith and healing action in this world. The pastoral church must be, and this is hard, a non-judgmental church. There is no sin which Jesus mentions more frequently in the gospel than the sin of judgmentalism. It's impressed people who wouldn't be in mainstream religion, someone like Mark Twain, who said one of the great comforts of religion is going to church every 8 days and hearing your neighbor's sins condemned. For it is a sin too easy for all of us to fall into. It is a mystery of the human soul why men and women feel better about themselves when they can point to the faults of others, especially religious people. Christ spoke of the standards of the gospel without compromise, but, at least to my reading, did not reject men and women for their inability to live at all times the fullness of the gospel. The third and final foundation for the pastoral theology that Pope Francis is tracing for the life of the church is the assertion that the church's pastoral identity and action must be rooted in the life situations that men and women actually experience in the world today. It is impossible to build up a pastoral church without explicitly investigating the signs of the times and then integrating the results of that investigation into the very core of the church's mission today. I've thought about the Holy Father's urgency to get to Lampedusa, and knowing a little bit about his ministry in Buenos Aires, I thought he had no contact with refugees when he was the bishop of that large city. The European immigration had stopped for all practical purposes. There was some interior migration in Latin America from Paraguay, but by and large, his ministry would not have been concerned. Why did he make it such a priority early on in his pontificate? Because he was reading the signs of times and places. And he realized that the great drama the world is facing today are the 62 million refugees and migrants across the face of the earth. It's said by one of the councils in the Vatican that today 1 out of every 42 people on the earth is a migrant or refugee. Reading the signs of the times also points out to the church from which Pope Francis comes. The Church of Latin America has contributed enormously to this dimension of the church's life by its adoption of the See, Judge, Act methodology as a pathway for understanding every element of the life and work of the church today. This methodology points out that pastoral theology be explicitly and thoroughly inductive in its method, a method that is rooted in the world as it is rather than in the world as it is imagined to be. Now, friends, I've learned as a bishop never to say in conclusion, because someone once said that the definition of second wind is what happens when a bishop says in conclusion. I'd like to just return to the question that was assigned to me, the question that Jesus asked. How did Christ answer the question that he proposed? Who is my sister and brother and mother to me? Well, of course you remember. In Luke's gospel, he says, my mother and my brothers are those who hear the word of God and act on it. The family of Jesus is not constituted by physical relationship with him, but by obedience to the word of God, obedience to his spoken words, but an embrace also of his way of thinking and acting. This is doing the will of his Father who sent him, the very God who so loved the world that he sent his Son. The gospel imperative is to listen to Jesus and then do likewise. For your patience, thank you very much. And I'm happy that we'll have a little time for questions.